He's gonna text back. Okay. So, average 150-pound person is right in the middle of this range. Okay? So, things that make your resting metabolic rate go up, there are two main things. One is muscle mass. The more muscle mass a person has, the higher their metabolic rate's going to be because muscle burns calories at rest and fat does not. The other thing is size. Whether a person's large because of muscle or a person's large because of fat, being large means you have extra surface area. The more surface area you have, the more heat you lose, so your body has to work harder to thermoregulate, and that burns calories. So the highest metabolic rate will be someone who's large because of a lot of muscle mass. Next highest will be someone who's large because of fat, and then as you get smaller, metabolic rate goes down. Jonathan?
Does gender play into resting metabolic rate?
So, I mean, men tend to have more muscle mass, so therefore tend to have larger metabolic rate. Yeah.
Oh, doesn't this also like kind of incorporate like the hormones as well that like kind of regulate your kind of
Yeah,
weight?
so there are going to be variations in this. These are estimates. These are estimates and averages. Okay, so resting metabolic rate is not actually the lowest you can go. It's kind of like if we took your heart rate right now. Like I said, we'd call it a resting heart rate because you've been sitting in your chair, but it's not actually the lowest your heart rate can go. It could go lower. So same thing with this. This is not a true resting. There's actually a number lower than that, which is called basal metabolic rate, which is the actual lowest your metabolic system can go. To find this, you would have to, so this will be a more accurate measurement. Okay, you would have to sleep for 8 hours, which I know you guys are doing every night anyway. Of course. You just sleep for 8 hours. You have to fast for 12 hours because digestion raises your metabolic rate and we're trying to slow everything down. You have to lie supine in a dimly lit thermoregulated room for an extended period of time to just slow your body down as far as we can go. And then we put a mask on you and we measure your actual oxygen consumption. And that will give you your actual lowest. So basal metabolic rate is a measurement of your lowest metabolic rate. Resting metabolic rate is an estimate. Okay, so the basal tends to be a couple hundred calories lower than the resting. So average here is somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 calories in a day. So if we calculated your resting metabolic rate at about 1,700, you can estimate your basal metabolic rate is probably about 1,500. It's probably about 200 or so calories below that. Go ahead.
Is there any other way other than resting in a room for like that many days, like to find out?
No, this is a measurement, and this is an estimate. Go ahead.
I'm not sure if it's relevant, but I just was curious why it has to be in a supine and not, you can't, or is it just for, to have the
Just to
monitors
get
on
most
you?
relaxed. Because standing up raises your blood pressure, because
No,
you
I
have to
meant
fight
versus,
against
like on
gravity.
the side,
Oh.
or like,
No, it's
No.
just more comfortable, because you'll
Oh.
be able to relax better if you're comfortable. Questions so far? So this is the true number that you should not eat below this number or your body will be in starvation mode. So we have basal metabolic rate, we have resting metabolic rate, then we have resting metabolic rate plus, you guys know what ADL stands for? Activities of daily living. So hopefully most of us are not staying in bed for 24 hours. You're getting up, you're going to school, you're going to work, maybe you're chasing your nephew around, maybe you're cleaning your house, you're being physically active through the day. So these are your activities of daily living. This does not include workouts. Workouts are separate from that. This is just how active you are in a day. Is your job sedentary? Are you sitting in a chair from 9 to 5? Is your job labor intensive and you're very active? This will be higher. Okay, so average RMR plus ADLs is somewhere between 1,800 and 3,000 calories in a day.
That's a huge range.
It is a huge range for people who are at different levels of active. So, but this is why all of our nutrition labels are based on a 2,000 calorie diet. Because 2,000 calories is average, right in the middle. Okay, so if you are a very active person, so this is typically a few 1,500 calories higher than your resting. If you're a pretty sedentary person, it's only gonna be a couple hundred calories more. If you're a very active person, it's gonna be several hundred calories more, okay, somewhere in the range. There actually is a way, more accurate way to estimate that, which is in the lab. It's way too far for me to go in lecture, but it is in the lab. Questions so far? Okay, so let's say we took this 150-pound person, we calculated their resting metabolic rate at about 1,700. So we're gonna estimate that their basal metabolic rate is about 1,500. And let's say they're moderately active, so their output is 2,000 calories on a typical day. Let's say they're trying to lose weight. If you're trying to lose weight, you have to be in a caloric deficit, which means you have to intake fewer calories than you're burning. So they have to be under 2,000, but they can't be under 1,500, because that's their basal and we're not trying to lose muscle. So this is their window of calorie intake. Okay? I don't know if you've ever counted calories before. 1,500 calories, not a whole lot of food. So if you'd like to be able to eat more than that and still lose weight, you have to increase your output, which means you have to exercise if you're trying to lose weight. Okay? So let's say this person does a 500 calorie workout. Now their output is 2,500 calories. They could safely eat 2,000 calories and be at a pretty significant deficit and well above their basal metabolic rate. Okay, so the more active you are, the more calories you can eat and still be in a deficit if you're trying to lose weight. Pretty cool stuff, yeah? Okay. Questions about that? I'm gonna move on. Done with math. Okay, so back to the very beginning of this chapter, I introduced the concept of the calorie, how it's a measurement of heat, direct calorimetry in the room with the water in the pipes, and we talked about the limitations of that, right? The treadmill producing heat, heat being absorbed by the walls. So we talked about indirect calorimetry, measuring oxygen consumption, converting that to energy expenditure, and then we kind of fell down this rabbit hole of math. Okay, we've been doing all these metabolic calculations. So now we need to go back and look at the limitations of indirect calorimetry, okay, which is kind of a big topic.
So tell me this could be, this is right as possible, but now we're gonna talk about one that can't be right?
We're gonna talk about what makes it, what its major limitation is. So, I gave you the caloric equivalent, 5 calories per liter. And when I gave you that number, it was on a video for you, I said it's not actually always 5. It actually ranges from like 4.8 to 5.1, depending on what substrate you're using, fat or carbohydrate. So in this class, we simplified and just call it a 5, and 446, depending on who you have, you might actually calculate something a little more accurate. But this number, like I said, it changes based on your substrate. So it's calculated based on the respiratory exchange ratio. We call it RER, and you need to know what that stands for. Respiratory exchange ratio. So this is a ratio between the volume of carbon dioxide that you're producing and the volume of oxygen that you're consuming. It's a ratio between the volume of carbon dioxide that you're producing and the volume of oxygen that you're consuming. Your body does not produce oxygen, it consumes it. Your body does not consume carbon dioxide, it produces it. Okay, so when you have the mask on in the lab, it's measuring how much oxygen you're consuming and how much carbon dioxide you're producing. And we're looking at that ratio. Go ahead.
Is there a significance to the dot above the V?
The dot above the V means per minute.
Per minute, okay.
So, this ratio gives us information about which substrate you're using. So, if we're looking at carbohydrates and fats, which one do you think will consume more oxygen when we're metabolizing it? Carbohydrate or fat? Fat. First of all, we can't metabolize fat without oxygen. We can metabolize carbohydrate without oxygen. And if you look at one molecule of carbohydrate and one molecule of fat, the fat is going to take us through the electron transport chain a lot more times, which is where oxygen is consumed. Okay, so when we're consuming fat, when we're metabolizing fat, this denominator is going to be a higher number. What does that do to the overall ratio? It makes it go down. So when you're metabolizing more fat, your RER will be lower. When you're metabolizing more carbohydrates, your RER will be higher. The range for RER is from 0.7 on the low end to 1 on the high end. So if your RER is 0.7, it means you're using 100% fat. If your RER is 1, it means you're using 100% carbohydrates. And if you're using a combination of the two, you're somewhere in between there. Can we ever be at an RER of 0.7?
No.
Why not?
You can't use 100% of one thing.
You can't be using 100% fat because glycolysis has to run or you die. So we're always using some carbohydrates. At rest, it's just a little bit, mostly fat, but we can never be 100% fat. So 0.7 is a theoretical RER. We never actually get there. Resting RER is about 0.8, mostly fat, but a little bit of carbohydrates. As we increase our exercise intensity, what's going to happen to our RER? Increase, decrease, or stay the same?
Increase.
It's going to increase. Why?
Because it's actually more.
We rely more on carbohydrates at higher intensities. Does that remind you of anything? Street. So, at low intensity, we're primarily using fat. As we increase intensity, we shift to primarily using carbohydrate. So, at low intensity, we start with a low RER. As we increase intensity, our RER increases because we're shifting to carbohydrates, because we're shifting to fast-twitch fibers, so we're shifting to anaerobic metabolism. Do you see how all those things connect?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Is that how because of the RER, is that how we ended up discovering the crossover concept, or was that prior to that?
I don't know which order it was. Okay, so this is a known ratio. We can actually count, I teach this in 446, not in 346, but we can count the molecules of oxygen, the molecules of carbon dioxide from fat and from carbohydrates. This is a known relationship. So the problem is, at higher intensities, we start producing excess carbon dioxide that is not accounted for here. Okay? There's carbon dioxide produced in our metabolic system, in the Krebs cycle and different places. But at higher intensities, there's carbon dioxide produced somewhere else. Let me show you where. You guys need to know these numbers and these ranges. Can I erase this?
You need to know
You need to know the difference between basal and resting. You need to know the number ranges.
okay, but not the two.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you say you want us to know the difference between basal and resting, what you mean exactly?
So what were the requirements for measuring basal?
The previous,
The sleeping, the fasting, yeah. And know that that number is lower than resting and more accurate. Okay, so
So would you measure based on basal then versus the resting?
Measure
or
what?
Sorry, like your caloric intake.
you want to do it based on basal, but basal isn't something we can measure unless you pay a whole lot of money.
Gotcha.
So you can calculate resting and then subtract a couple hundred from it to estimate your basal. Okay, HLA is abbreviation for lactic acid. What are the possible fates of lactic acid? Perfect. One of those is the buffer.
Bicarbonate.
Now we're gonna talk about the buffer. The bicarbonate buffer.
Physio.
Bicarbonate buffer is HCO3. It is in your blood. Its job is to pick up the hydrogen from the lactic acid. We know lactic acid has hydrogen because look at how we produced it. The NADH handed its hydrogen and electron to pyruvate, which turned it into lactate. So the hydrogen is what makes this an acid, and it's what's going to cause fatigue, and it has to be cleared. So the bicarbonate buffer is going to neutralize the hydrogen, so it can't cause any problems. It's going to pick up the hydrogen. That's going to become H2CO3. All we did was add a hydrogen on there. This is carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is going to dissociate or split water and carbon dioxide. All we did was rearrange the molecules.
Are there enzymes needed?
Actually, there is,
Are they
I
really
can't think of it off the top of my head. You might learn it in 446. I want to say carbonic amyl hydrase or something like that.
I'll remember.
In the fall when you take 446. Okay, so we don't have just a hydrogen by itself anymore, so we've neutralized it so it can't cause problems. The water can just be in your blood. Carbon dioxide at this point is in your blood, but as it travels through your body, it gets into your lungs, it's going to diffuse into your lungs, and you're going to exhale it. Okay, so exhaling carbon dioxide is helping you clear the hydrogen from your lactic acid. But this excess carbon dioxide is going to drive this number unnaturally high. Unnaturally high. It's only supposed to go up to 1. But at high intensities, we're going to end up with an RER of 1.1 or 1.2, which theoretically shouldn't be possible. If it's just measuring your substrate use, it only goes up to 1. So this is excess carbon dioxide going to drive the RER above 1. The RER is what gives us our caloric equivalent. So when the RER gets above 1, it makes our calculations less accurate. You don't need to know the details of that. Just understand that it's throwing off our calculation and makes it less accurate. Okay, so in a nutshell, I'm going to say this a few times, so just listen the first time I say it. Don't try to write down every word. I promise I'll repeat it. In a nutshell, the main limitation of indirect calorimetry is that it's less accurate at the higher intensities because it doesn't account for the carbon dioxide that's produced from the bicarbonate buffer. That excess carbon dioxide drives the RER above 1, which makes our calculations less accurate. Let's say that again. Major limitation of indirect calorimetry. It's less accurate at higher intensities because it doesn't account for the carbon dioxide that's produced in the bicarbonate buffer. That excess carbon dioxide drives the RER above 1 and throws off our calculations. Let me say it again. Okay, I'm going to add one term here. This carbon dioxide, so there is carbon dioxide produced in our metabolic systems in the Krebs cycle. This carbon dioxide is produced outside our metabolic system, so we call this non-metabolic carbon dioxide. So I'm just going to throw that term in there. Major limitation of indirect calorimetry. It's less accurate at higher intensities because it doesn't account for the non-metabolic carbon dioxide that's produced from the bicarbonate buffer. That excess carbon dioxide drives the RER above 1 and makes our calculations less accurate. So when we're doing this indirect calorimetry, as you get to the higher intensities, it gets less and less accurate. Okay? The book will also say that it doesn't account for anaerobic ATP production. So it assumes, the calculations for indirect calorimetry assume that your ATP production is aerobic. Lactic acid is not produced when you're working aerobically, right? So this is only happening at the higher intensities when you're anaerobic. Make sense? Aren't you recording? Okay, major limitation of indirect calorimetry. Less accurate at the higher intensities because it doesn't account for the non-metabolic carbon dioxide produced from the bicarbonate buffer. That excess carbon dioxide drives the RER above 1, makes our calculations less accurate. Okay, you need to know what RER stands for, what the formula is, what the range is, and what this tells us. Gives us information about which substrate you're using. Okay. One more important topic that I'm going to get to today. I'm going to leave that there. Can I erase this? Good. Lactate threshold. Lactate threshold is a very, very important concept that's going to be brought up a lot over the rest of the semester and in 446. I'm going to give you a definition first and then we'll discuss it. Lactate threshold is the point at which lactic acid begins to accumulate as exercise intensity increases. Lactic threshold is the point at which lactic acid begins to accumulate as exercise intensity increases. Notice I'm not saying the point lactic acid begins to be produced. Lactic acid is always being produced. Okay? None of our systems ever shut off. But at low and moderate intensities, it's being produced a little bit, and we have all those different ways to clear it so it doesn't accumulate. But if you keep increasing your intensity, at some point, you're going to be producing the lactic acid faster than you can clear it, and it's going to start accumulating. That's your lactate threshold. One more time. Lactate threshold, the point at which lactic acid begins to accumulate as exercise intensity increases. So there's a graph for that. Here's our intensity. Low, medium, high. This is going to be blood lactate. Low, medium, high. Okay, at low intensity, blood lactate's never going to be 0, okay, but it's going to be low. You increase your intensity a little bit, no problem, we're still clearing it. You increase your intensity a little bit, no problem, we're still clearing it. At low to moderate intensity, lactic acid is not a problem. But at some point, you're going to hit a bump in intensity where you start producing lactic acid faster than you can clear it. And it's going to start accumulating. And if you continue increasing your intensity, lactic acid is going to accumulate rapidly. So this point right here is lactate threshold. The point at which lactic acid begins to accumulate as we're increasing intensity. This is what I was trying to have you find during your treadmill assignment. Bump up the intensity a little bit, I'm comfortable. Bump up the intensity a little bit, I'm comfortable. Bump up the intensity one more time, and I'm starting to feel something. Warmth in my legs, breathing rate increasing, that's this. Still an intensity you could maintain for a while, but it feels different than the intensity before it. That's what I was trying to have you find. Questions so far? Okay. Notice that this lactate threshold is happening at moderate intensity. Average untrained person hits their lactate threshold at about 50% of their VO2 max. Average untrained person hits their lactate threshold at about 50% of their VO2 max. So, if we have a person who has a VO2 max of 40 mLs per kg per minute, and they hit their lactate threshold at 50% of their VO2 max, where are they hitting their lactate threshold? Could you figure out what speed that is? All you have to do is plug it into the running formula with a 0 grade. It tells you what speed this is. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it's not very fast. let's say it's 5 miles per hour. Someone who has a VO2 max of 40, who hits their lactate threshold at 50%, is gonna start feeling uncomfortable at about 5 miles per hour. They're not gonna like running very much. We can increase the lactate threshold through training, which is gonna make you like running a lot better. Let me tell you how we do that. 2 ways to increase lactate threshold. Okay. So, remember, when we're hitting lactate threshold, it's because we're producing lactic acid faster than we clear it. So we have 2 options to solve this problem. We can either get better at clearing it, or we can produce less of it. Okay, so our first option is going to be to clear the lactic acid faster. Okay, our main way of clearing lactic acid is with the bicarbonate buffer. So if we increase the amount of bicarbonate buffer we have, we're going to clear the lactic acid faster. The way we get the body to increase our bicarbonate buffer is by using it. If you want something in your body to change and adapt, you have to challenge it. So at what intensity do we use our bicarbonate buffer? High intensity. If we're below our lactate threshold, we're not producing much lactic acid, we don't need the buffer much. It's intensities above our lactate threshold where we use the buffer and we challenge that pathway. So if you want to improve that pathway, you have to work at intensities above your lactate threshold, which is by definition high intensity. Hold on one second. So when you're working at high intensity, you can't hold that intensity for very long because the hydrogen is going to cause fatigue. So we do this in intervals, right? Work, recover, work, recover, work, recover. You've heard of high intensity interval training? That's what this is. So is this aerobic or anaerobic? So if we do high intensity interval training, it's going to trigger our body to produce more bicarbonate buffer, which means we're going to get better at clearing the lactic acid, which means our lactate threshold is now not going to happen until here. So maybe before we were hitting our lactate threshold at 5 miles per hour, now we can go up to 6 miles per hour before we start feeling uncomfortable. Because we're better at clearing the lactic acid. Make sense? Questions before I move on to the next one? Okay, our other way of increasing lactate threshold would be to produce less lactic acid. To do that, we have to look at why we're producing lactic acid in the first place. Why is lactic acid being produced at high intensities?
Excess.
Mitochondria is full, so the NADH has to reduce the pyruvate. So, to make this better, we grow more mitochondria, or increase the size of the mitochondria we have. That way we can accommodate more hydrogen in here and produce less lactic acid. It's like remodeling the women's bathroom at the Staples Center. Before it used to just be a little bathroom with 4 stalls and it would always fill up and there would be a line. We remodel it. Now it's a massive bathroom with 50 stalls and you just go in.
We should do that with every movie.
True. So the idea is we can keep increasing intensity to a higher level before this overflow starts happening, which is what lactate threshold is. So now we're comfortable at a higher intensity before lactic acid starts accumulating. We've increased our lactate threshold. Question?
Are you gonna explain how we grow more mitochondria? or-
Yes.
Okay. I didn't wanna ask the
Thank
question
you.
before you
I
said
actually
it.
I almost forgot.
Oh,
So-
okay.
We need to increase mitochondrial density. That's size and number of mitochondria. And please understand, the increase in mitochondrial density by itself is not useful. We also need the capillaries and the myoglobin and the oxidative enzymes. Okay, I'm not writing all that down, but all those things need to happen. What intensity do we need to work at to do this? Low to moderate intensity. Challenging your mitochondria is going to be below lactate threshold. Endurance training. So, low to moderate intensity, aerobic, endurance training. So if you find that 5 miles per hour is the fastest speed you can maintain comfortably, you train at that speed, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever you can do. Your body's gonna respond to that by increasing mitochondrial density, and you're gonna notice now I can go to 5.5 and be comfortable. Now I can go to 6 and be comfortable because you've grown more mitochondria. Go ahead.
If we wanted to increase our VO2 max, could both of these work? Or
Mhm. Both of them will, yeah, and we're gonna get to that at some point too. So, where your lactate threshold is going to affect your endurance performance. Like if you are racing in a 5K, you want to run 3 miles as fast as you can. Wherever your lactate threshold is going to determine your race pace. The higher your lactate threshold, the faster speed you can maintain long term. Lactate threshold does not affect your sprinting performance. Your sprinting performance happens up here. Okay, lactate threshold is basically where you're shifting from primarily aerobic to relying more on your anaerobic metabolism. If you're sprinting way up here, it doesn't matter what speed you shift from aerobic to anaerobic. It doesn't make any difference. Where this matters is when you want to keep a fast pace for a long time. This is going to determine what your pace is. Okay, so my son, who was a distance runner, used to come home from practice and say, "Mom, I'm a distance runner. Why are we always doing sprints in practice?" Well, son, do you understand why distance runners should be doing sprint training? Yeah, they should be doing both types of training. It's like if someone asks you, "I'm trying to lose weight. Should I eat less or should I move more?" The answer is yes, you should do both. If you just do one, you might see a little bit of improvement, but if you do both, you're working at it from both angles, you're gonna get better results. Okay, so both of these training practices will increase your lactate threshold from different angles. One is working on clearing and one is working on production. So if you do both, that's when you're gonna get the highest lactate threshold. That's where you're gonna have the best endurance performance. You have a faster race pace. What questions do you have for me? Go ahead.
So, the first one is theoretically, if you were to, this will mess up your body and your metabolic system as we're getting stuff out. But if you were to take like a capsule of more bicarbonate and you were doing a high intense exercise, would you last longer and kind of falsely move your lactate threshold just because your bicarbonate would be able to move more hydrogen out of the blood?
I haven't read any research on supplementing bicarbonate.
Obviously, it's gonna mess with your kidneys, so it's where like.
Yeah, I think it gives you some gastrointestinal issues. I don't know that it's been, it what? Well, it'll eventually get into your blood if you take it in pill form. I've never read anything that actually shows it has an ergogenic effect, or it would be in widespread use.
Because I feel like it might actually work at like high intensity, so once you need that, it'll take it out faster and.
All right, I'm gonna stop there. We have one more topic in this chapter that we'll get to next week. we have questions, come on up.